Greetings. We are going to be continuing our study that we've been doing on Sunday mornings, looking at a vision for the church. The first several classes that we had all dealt under the major heading of peacemakers. The church is supposed to be peacemakers, and we talked about the idea of reversing the Tower of Babel, and we've talked about the idea of bringing in together a diverse body into one family, and that's actually central to the message of the gospel. And one of the greatest demonstrations of that is the meal that we share with one another, whether it's the Lord's Supper or the common meal. You see both of those emphasized throughout the New Testament as demonstrations of the peace that we are supposed to be bringing about in our world. We're supposed to be lights that shine in the world around us, that show the rest of the world how to do things the right way. And that means there's going to be changes in the way that the world has generally been run, and that means that the church is called to lead the way in some of those changes. Well, having discussed peace, we are now moving on to the second major heading of this class, which is the idea of politics. Before you get too uncomfortable, when I talk about politics, I'm not so much going to be talking about modern American politics or who you ought to vote for right now, although I think certainly there are going to be implications in our class and in our study on the way you view modern politics. But we're mostly going to be looking at what I would call the politics of Jesus. What I mean by that is when Jesus came, he came bringing with him a kingdom. And the word kingdom is a politically loaded word. It's a word that people hear and they immediately think that there's a new king. In fact, Jesus wears the title of king. Jesus wears the title of Christ or Messiah. Jesus talks about giving faith or allegiance. He talks about many things that we have so Christianized certain words like faith or repentance or church or kingdom that we forget that those words actually had real political connotations prior to Christianity, and they probably should still today. What I mean by that is we should really think of ourselves as citizens of a different kind of kingdom. Not just, Christianity is in the realm of my quiet, personal, religious piety, but then my politics are in the realm of, who you vote for, Republican, Democrat, all that type of stuff. When Jesus came, that distinction, I don't think, is so much there. Jesus isn't just giving us quiet religious piety and personal beliefs. Jesus is giving us a new way to see the world, a new way to see kingdom, a new kind of politic, a new kind of way of doing politics. There is a quote from a book that I read recently that I think does a pretty good job at explaining this. It says, "We must deconstruct our paltry notions about what Christianity itself is and come anew to the conviction that Christianity is not a religion, it is a politic. By politic, I mean an all-encompassing manner of communal life that grapples with all the questions that the classical art of politics has always asked. How do we live together? How do we deal with offenses? How do we deal with money? How do we deal with enemies and violence? How do we arrange marriage and family and social structures? How is authority mediated, employed, ordered? How do we rightfully order passions and appetites? And much more besides, but especially add these. Where is human history headed? What does it mean to be human? And what does it look like to live in a rightly ordered human community that engenders flourishing, justice, and the peace of God?" Those are the types of questions that governments seek to answer. Those are the types of questions that countries, through political means, try to instill and try to give direction to. But those are the very things that Jesus and his kingdom gave answers to. Those are the very things that ought to impact the way that we live and the way that we think. Because Jesus didn't just change our private spirituality. He changed our politics. He changed our manner of life. He changed the way that we view the world, and he changed to whom we give our allegiance to. And so all of that being said, I think that this second section of class, after dealing with peacemaking, we're now going to be looking at the politics of Jesus. And there's no way to do that without trying to grapple with the idea of the cross. Jesus was not crucified because he told people to love their neighbor or because he read his Bible or because he went to synagogue. The idea of loving your neighbor and the idea of going to synagogue and the idea of some of those, what we might call, beautiful religious teachings, weren't going to upset the Romans all that much. The Romans were actually pretty pluralistic. You could worship anyone you wanted to, basically, just as long as you showed your allegiance to Rome and you obeyed the laws. And so even the earliest persecutions of Rome against the church under Nero, those weren't so much done because the church worshipped Jesus. That was done because of the crime of arson. Now, they didn't actually commit arson, but that's what they were charged with, was burning the city of Rome. And so, like, the Roman government, they weren't just out to destroy you for worshiping Jesus. They were pretty cool with whoever you wanted to worship. But it was when you did things like you refused to give your loyalty or allegiance to Rome, or you refused to offer a Roman sacrifice, or you refused to go along with the cult of emperor worship, that Rome started to bear down on the church. And it was because of other things like rumors that would emerge about practices of the church that weren't even accurate. And so all of that is a way of saying that Jesus came, and the reason he was crucified, it wasn't just because of his teachings about religious matters. It was because of claims that he was the Christ, or the Messiah, or the King, or he was bringing a kingdom. If you remember when Jesus is born and Herod hears that there is the King of the Jews, what does he want to do when he hears that title, King of the Jews? Well, he wants to have all the babies in Bethlehem killed. Why? Because calling yourself a king is a threat to the person who's on the throne. Now, the same thing is true with the crucifixion of Jesus. Pilate, he was told, this man is making himself out to be a king, and whoever calls himself a king is no friend of Caesar. Jesus, by wearing the title king, became a threat to the ones who sit on thrones on this earth. And so when Jesus was crucified, they did so mocking the idea that he could be a king. They put purple robes on him. They beat him to a pulp, and they put a crown of thorns on his head. The charge above his head while he was on the cross was the King of the Jews. Jesus was crucified for his political stance about who the true king of the world is, for his political stance about what kingdom really matters and really is true and really comes from God. And so all of that is a way of saying, the more that we understand the politics of Jesus, the better we'll be able to grasp the irony of the cross. Because when the cross was taught, according to Paul, it was foolishness to the Gentiles, and it was a stumbling block to the Jews. Because that's not the way either of them had ever envisioned politics before. If you ask the Jews in the time of Jesus what kingdom they're longing for, they're going to think something like the kingdom of King David. If you read through the Old Testament, you'll see a number of times where great leaders in Israel's past had given them political freedom, had given them autonomy as a country. You would see it like with Moses, who led them out of Egypt, and through the 10 plagues destroyed the Egyptians. You'll see it with King David, who established a powerful dynasty and monarchy in Israel. He established a monarchy so that people sang songs about him. He was very successful in his military victories in order to do that also. David was the one who could kill giants. David is the one who they sang songs about, that Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. The idea is that David was a mighty warrior, and he was able to use that in order to establish a kingdom. And there was this promise made that a son of David would sit on this throne. And if you looked at the history of Israel, you see that there was a son of David on the throne, all the way up until the Babylons came and destroyed the monarchy, destroyed the city of Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. So now the promise kind of hung in the air. Well, is there still going to be a son of David on the throne? Where is the son of David? Did God's promise fail? Your options are either that God's promise failed, or there's a son of David who's coming, who's going to sit on a throne again. And that's where messianic expectation started to arise. This idea that there would be this coming son of David who would establish their kingdom, reestablish the monarchy, give them power and rule over their enemies. But that's hard to envision right now because the Romans had become the ruling power of the world and were occupying Jerusalem. And so this son of David, much like Moses defeated the Egyptians, or David defeated the Philistines, this son of David would have to rise up against the Roman Empire. And so all of this kind of swirled into what they expected their Messiah to be. What they did not expect was for their Messiah to become enthroned as king, for him to be inaugurated as king through being crucified by the Romans. That's the exact opposite. That's just foolishness to the Gentiles. That's a stumbling block to the Jews. But to those of us who are called, it's the power and the wisdom of God. There is a challenge here to revision, to re-see, and to see in a completely new way everything that you thought you knew about politics. And so, in order to see that, I want to look at the Gospel of Mark with you, and we're going to look at how difficult this journey is for the disciples of Jesus. We're going to look at how difficult it is for Peter and the other followers who are with Jesus, and they see these incredible things that Jesus does, yet they have the old world paradigm of what politics is. And that's what Jesus is trying to get them to change and reshape. He very specifically tells them that the Gentiles, they lord it over their people. The rulers of the Gentiles, they exercise authority. But it is not to be this way among you, because among you the least shall be first. That's why the king is the one who's crucified, because the one who you think of as the least and the one who's receiving the worst treatment is actually the one who is most blessed. There's this paradox, this irony that takes place. And Jesus is trying to get them to rethink their whole view of politics. Politics is not about having the most power. Politics is about resisting having power in order that you may truly serve. And so there's this call to view things in a completely new way. And that's what the disciples are going to struggle with, and that's what Jesus is going to try to teach. So we'll see this conversation and this lesson taking place throughout the Gospel of Mark. And so turn with me first to Mark chapter 4. We're going to begin with a series of miracles that Jesus does, and these miracles are going to help the disciples to come to see some realities about Jesus while at the same time struggling to fully realize or understand the meaning of those realities. So the first one is when Jesus stills the sea. They're out on the water. Verse 37 of Mark chapter 4. There arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat, so much that the boat was already filling up. Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him, and they said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he got up, and he rebuked the wind. And he said to the sea, Hush, be still. And the wind died down, and the sea became perfectly calm. And he said to them, Why are you afraid? Do you not have any faith, or do you still have no faith? And then they became very much afraid, and they said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? All right, so you have Jesus and his disciples out on a storm in this fierce, or out on the water, and this fierce storm arises. While the disciples are worried to death, Jesus is calmly sleeping. They wake him, and Jesus looks at the wind and the sea. He rebukes the wind and the sea. He gives an order to the wind and the sea, and the wind and the sea obey him. They reverently hush and calm down at the message of Jesus. Jesus is the one who can give a command to creation itself, and creation will reverently obey it. And that is an amazing but kind of terrifying thought to the disciples, because they don't fully understand who Jesus is. In fact, this whole story ends with that question. Verse 41, they became very much afraid. After he said, Why are you so afraid? They become even more afraid, and they say, Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? And the thing that I love about the Gospel of Mark is he'll often ask those types of questions or end stories like that without ever giving you the answer that you're seeking. So this story ends right here with the question, and then it moves on to the next story in chapter 5. But that question is left in the air. Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? I don't know if the disciples have the right answer yet, but that's something that we are supposed to try to grapple with. Okay, so the next story we're going to read is in Mark chapter 6, verse 33. This is Jesus feeding the 5,000. So the first one we're going to look at is a miracle on the Sea of Galilee. And then we're going to look at a feeding miracle where he feeds the 5,000. Then we'll look at another miracle on the sea, then another food miracle. And then we'll see them emerge into one powerful story that kind of sets up the stage for the second half of the Gospel of Mark. But if you look at Mark 6:33, says, the people saw them going, and many recognized them and ran together on foot to all the cities and got ahead of them. So the people see Jesus and his disciples going. Where they're going is on a boat to the other side of the sea. Specifically, verse 33, they are going to a secluded place, by themselves. That word secluded right there is an important one. It's actually going to be the same word that the wilderness is called in the story of Moses. When he leads the children of Israel out of Egypt into the wilderness, it is a deserted place, a secluded place. It's a place where humans don't inhabit. It's an uninhabitable place where people don't live. So they're away from cities and towns, and they're in the uninhabitable place. That's where Jesus is taking his disciples, just like that's where Moses took the children of Israel after the Egyptian slavery. Then you get to verse 34, and it says, when Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it was already quite late, the disciples came to him and said, this place is desolate, and it's already quite late. Send them away, that they may go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered and said, you give them something to eat. So they're recognizing, look, we're in this deserted area. We came by ourselves, but the crowds ran over here to join us, and there's no food here. So what are we going to do for these people? There's not nearly enough to feed these people. And so Jesus says, well, you solve this problem. And that's an interesting thing for Jesus to say. The hope is maybe they have been seeing and learning about Jesus, and they are going to recognize the source that they have right there with them. But the reality is they don't seem to. They start counting their dollars and cents, and they recognize we don't have enough money. They say in verse 37, they said to him, shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread to give them something to eat? Could you imagine feeding 5,000 people? And verse 38, then Jesus says, well, how many loaves do you have? Go look. And they went and they found out, and they said, 5 and 2 fish. And he commanded them all to sit down by groups on the green grass. And they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up towards heaven, he blessed the food and broke the loaves. And he was giving them out to the disciples to set before them. So the disciples are, in a sense, giving food to the people. They're just doing it from Jesus, the source, to the disciples, and they're bringing it to the people. And then it says he divided up the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 12 full baskets of broken pieces and also a fish, and there were 5,000 who ate the loaves. All right, so that story right there is pretty incredible. It's one where you should immediately connect Jesus to the figure of Moses. Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt. He fed he fed them with bread from heaven, although it was actually God feeding them with bread from heaven. But Moses is the one who was the leader when the people were miraculously fed there in the wilderness. So now Jesus has the people in the wilderness, and he's going to miraculously feed them also. He's going to do so where he himself takes the role of God, the one who is providing the food for the people. And so an incredible story. Jesus feeds the 5,000. Store that away, because as we'll see, the disciples are supposed to learn something from this. They fail to, but they're supposed to. And we're going to see where that kind of builds on to the next story, which is another water miracle story. If you look at verse 45, same chapter, it immediately goes into the story about, or the miracle about Jesus walking on the water. It says in verse 45, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into a boat and go ahead of him to the other side of Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowds away. And after bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain to pray. Kind of sounds like Moses going up on the mountain. So the disciples get in the boat and they leave. He sends the crowds away to where Jesus is alone in the secluded place in the wilderness, and he goes up on the mountain. Verse 47, when it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. And seeing them straining at the oar, for the wind was against them, it was about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and he intended to pass by them. And so Jesus sees them out there, he sees the wind and the waves, and he begins to walk on the sea. Again, demonstrating his power over creation itself. Also, in some ways, perhaps, showing that he is even greater than Moses. Because in the wilderness, when the manna came from heaven, Moses was the leader, but Moses wasn't the one who could literally do that with food. God could do that. So in that story, Jesus takes on the role not of Moses per se, although that's the connection people would make, but of God himself. And then in the next story, Moses was able to cross the sea, right? but he did so because God split the sea for him, and he was able to walk across on dry land. Jesus doesn't need the sea split. Jesus can walk as though the water itself is dry land. And so Jesus is kind of being, in some ways, compared with Moses, but then shown to be even greater than Moses in these. And remember, Moses is that political leader who gave them freedom from their enemies. The Israelites, the disciples, they're going to see Jesus doing this and be able to make connections. Maybe he's the one who could free us from our enemies. And so all of this is going to be kind of in the air as these stories continue. But notice what happens. Jesus is walking by. They see him, but who do they think it is? Verse 49. When they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost, and they cried out, and they became, for they all saw him and were terrified. So if you remember the first miracle on the sea, it says they became afraid. He says, why are you afraid? They become even more afraid, and they say, who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Well, they see him again now, and their response is fear. They're terrified. And immediately he spoke with them, and he says, don't fear, take courage, I am. Which my translation says, it is I, but very literally, that's the same phrase that God uses from the bush. I am. And then he says, do not be afraid. God's often the one who's encouraging people. Do not be afraid. I am with you. And so Jesus in this story also is taking on the role of God. He's walking on the water. He's walking out to his disciples. Their disciples respond with fear, and they're astounded. They're amazed at this. And it's because they're not expecting it from Jesus, because they haven't quite learned who Jesus is yet. And so, verse 51, then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. So notice it says, the reason they're so amazed and so terrified is because they didn't learn anything from the previous miracles Jesus has done. They didn't learn anything from Jesus feeding the 5,000. Well, why didn't they learn something? Well, their heart was hardened. In what ways were their heart hardened? I think perhaps sometimes we can be so fixated on our political allegiances and our view of the way things should be that we can miss what's happening right in front of us. This is going to become more clear here in a little bit when Jesus tries to explain the cross and they just can't get it, or they rebuke him, or they ignore him. It's because they disagree with him about who he is supposed to be. So right now they're seeing the miracles and it's not computing, it's not adding up. They're missing who they are supposed to be seeing here, and it's because they have a hard heart. But it's going to be a long and strenuous journey to get them to recognize not only who Jesus is, that he's the Messiah, but what kind of Messiah he is. And so when you get to chapter 8, we'll start to see those types of ideas emerge by looking at our fourth miracle and then what that sets up to follow. The fourth miracle is Jesus feeding the 4,000 this time. So it's back to another food miracle. And Jesus, there's this large crowd. Chapter 8 and verse 2, Jesus again says, I feel compassion for the people. Notice how similar that is to chapter 6 and verse 34. Jesus felt compassion for them. So these stories are going to be very similar. You should read them remembering the previous story. But he feels compassion for them. They remain with me 3 days with nothing to eat. If I send them away to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come a very long distance. So the disciples answered him, and their answer isn't, well, why don't you just do what you did last time? That would be the answer someone gives who learned from the previous experience. This time, they say, where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place? So again, they're in a desert place, to satisfy these people. And he was asking them, well, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. And he directed the people to sit down on the ground. So remember, that's what he did last time. Last time it said he made them sit down in groups of 50s and 100s on the green grass. Well, now he directs the people to sit down, and he takes the 7 loaves, and giving thanks, he broke them and started giving them to the disciples to serve to them, and they served them to the people. They also had a few small fish. So again, bread, fish, feeding the thousands. He has compassion on them. He talks to the disciples. The disciples aren't getting, the proper thing. The disciples are they're thinking about money or how much they can possibly do this. So the story is following a very similar arc to the previous story. And then verse 8, They all ate and were satisfied. That's the same way that, Mark chapter 6 and verse 42, they all ate and were satisfied. And then it tells you how many baskets they picked up after. The previous one, they picked up 12 baskets. Here, it says in verse 8, they picked up 7 large baskets full of what was left over of the broken people. And then just like the previous one ended by telling you it was 5,000, this one ends by telling you it's 4,000, and then he sends them away. And then they get in a boat and they leave. So, Jesus has just done 2 miracles that we've seen where he fed thousands of people with bread. He's done 2 miracles on the Sea of Galilee where he's calmed storms and walked on water. All right, so now we're going to see all of those events emerge into one story where they're on a boat in the Sea of Galilee with Jesus talking about bread. Remember the previous boat story where Jesus walks on the water? It says the reason they didn't get that one is because they didn't gain any insight from the incident with the bread because their hearts were hardened. We're going to see again, they're not gaining anything from these miracles. They're on the sea and they're not recognizing what they should be recognizing. And we'll see again that their hearts are hard. It'll specifically say that about them. So they get there, they leave, they're on the boat, and notice verse 14. This is what the disciples start thinking about while they're on the boat. And they had forgotten to take bread. And they did not have any more than 1 loaf on the boat with them. Oh no, there isn't enough bread. Whatever will we do? So that's the struggle the disciples start having. Verse 15, Jesus was giving them orders saying, watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod. Okay, so you have the Herodians and the Pharisees. They made actually, in chapter 3 and verse 6, the Herodians and the Pharisees began conspiring together as to how they're going to destroy Jesus. We see them come later to Jesus with a coin and they try to trap him as to what he's going to do and about paying taxes. So you see the Herodians and Pharisees, they are political enemies, but the one thing that has tended to unite them is neither of them like Jesus very much. And so the leaven of the Herodians and Pharisees, I think, so if you read Matthew, I think he mentions the hypocrisy of them. But that's what you see. You have these political ideas, and one of the things that separates them is the Pharisees are very antagonistic towards Rome. They don't like their Roman overlords and they want freedom. The Herodians are thinking, no, the best way to get along with this is to support your Roman appointed king like Herod. You give your allegiance to Rome, whereas the Pharisees don't want to give their allegiance to Rome. And so they tend to have different views, but what both of them can agree upon is they don't want to give their allegiance to Jesus. And so Jesus says, beware of the Pharisee, the Herodians, and the Pharisees, the hypocrisy or the leaven of the Herodians and Pharisees. And the disciples hear that, and they don't get any sort of political message from it. What they get is, verse 16, they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. Remember, they forgot the bread. There's only 1 loaf. What are we going to do? Whatever can we do? What happened the first time when Jesus said, you feed them? They said, you want us to spend 200 denarii on bread? Or the second time they were in a deserted place and Jesus was talking to them about, we need to get these people some food. And they say, how will we ever get so much bread here? Both times, Jesus miraculously fed thousands of people. Now they're on a boat and they think, oh no, we only have 1 piece of bread. So this is where the rebuke comes in from Jesus. If you look at verse 17, Jesus, aware of this, he said to them, why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? And they said, 12. He said, and when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? And they said to him, 7. And he said, do you not yet understand? So notice the problem. He mentions, do you have a hard heart? He says, do you have eyes but not see? Who has eyes but don't see? Well, blind people. Jesus is saying, you guys are blind. Like all of these things are happening, but your hearts are hardened, your ears are deaf, and your eyes are blind. Because you're not recognizing, you're not seeing and understanding. Do you not yet see? And so Jesus has been doing all of these things that we've looked at to try to get them to see something. And they're not seeing it yet. but they're about to start seeing it. And this is where it gets really interesting, because Jesus just called them blind. He just said they have eyes but don't see. He just said numerous times, do you not yet see? Do you not see what's happening here? And then the first thing they do once they reach land is they bring Jesus a blind person. So just like the parables of Jesus often have deeper meanings than just the story, there's a deeper symbolic meaning behind it. The same thing I think is true with many of the miracles that he does. And I think this miracle of healing the blind man is supposed to represent the journey of the disciples. Here's why we'll see what happens. They bring him the blind man. Jesus, he spits in the guy's eyes, and he puts his hands on him, and he says, do you see anything? And then verse 24, the man says, I see men, but I see them like trees walking around. So it's like he can kind of see, which he hadn't been able to do, but he can't clearly see at all what he's trying to see. It looks like trees are walking around rather than people. And so then Jesus laid his hands on him. He looked intently and was restored, and he began to see, verse 25 ends, everything clearly. He started to see, but it was murky. He wasn't seeing correctly. He was seeing things, but the things weren't actually what was there. But then the second part of the miracle, Jesus helps him see correctly, see clearly. So this is the only miracle, the only time, by the way, this miracle is recorded. It's only here in Mark. It's unique to Mark. But why is it that Jesus healed this guy in two different stages? And the first time did kind of like a 50% healing, and then the second time did it a complete way. Why is that? Well, I don't think it's just because Jesus was having an off day. And I don't think there's any indication that it's because the blind man's faith wasn't good enough the first time and then it got better or anything like that. I think it's because very intentionally, we're supposed to be seeing a picture of what's about to happen with the disciples. The disciples have yet to recognize that Jesus is the Christ. Nowhere in Mark have they said anything like that so far. They have been terrified. They have been confused. They have been blind. They have had hard hearts. That's all we've seen about them so far, is that they have not had faith and that they have asked questions, who then is this? But they haven't had answers. Now Jesus is going to try to take them in the next step. And I think what you're going to get next is the step where they start to see, but they're not seeing clearly. They're seeing people, but they look like trees. They're seeing Jesus. They're even going to see that he's the Messiah, but they're not going to see what it means that he's the Messiah or what type of Messiah he is. So look at Mark chapter 8. Jesus he continues. He takes them to Caesarea Philippi. He begins asking them, who is it that people say that I am? And he gets all of these wrong answers, all of these blind answers. But then he says, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ. Chapter 8 and verse 29. That's the first time that they have called him the Christ or the Messiah. It's up to this point in the Gospel of Mark. They have not been getting it so far. They've been blind, but now they're starting to see. But Jesus responds in verse 30. He warned them to tell no one about him. Well, why? Why would Jesus, why would he say don't tell people that he's the Christ? Isn't that an important idea? Well, remember, we're talking about reshaping someone's politics here. What does Peter think about the Christ? Peter thinks that Christ is going to destroy the Roman Empire and to establish a kingdom. He has this idea of the Christ becoming that Davidic son of David, that king who's going to establish a reign in Jerusalem and rule and defeat all of their enemies. And so what that means for Peter is that he has something to be excited about. He's on the inside track. He is like the right-hand man of the new king, Messiah, Christ. This is a very exciting idea and thought for him. And so when Peter has that idea, Jesus says, don't tell anyone, because you might preach that I'm the Christ, but you'll preach the wrong kind of Christ. You're seeing me, but I look like a tree right now. You're not seeing me for who I really am. Clear vision will come a little bit later. So Jesus then at this point, he tries to start clearing things up. This is where Jesus begins letting them know what the plan is. Verse 31, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and after 3 days rise again. And he was stating the matter plainly, but Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So the reason Peter probably shouldn't be out teaching that Jesus is the Christ is because when Jesus mentions that he will die and rise again, Peter rebukes him for it. Peter does not have the right idea about the Christ. Peter does not have the right idea about the king. Peter does not have a right idea about the kingdom at this point, which is why he probably shouldn't go telling everyone about Jesus being the Christ. If you look at verse 33, we'll find out Peter's problem. It says, Jesus turned around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's." That's one of the biggest problems of politics of this world is Peter is focusing on what will be the benefit to him, on man's interests, rather than what God is actually doing in the world. And so, verse 34, Jesus summons the crowd and his disciples, and he says, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it." So instead of the idea being, let's become the most powerful people and destroy our enemies and save our lives, Jesus says, actually, the one who loses his life is the one who will save it. He's reversing the way that we perhaps think about death, at least in terms of allegiance to your kingdom. He then says in verse 36, "For what will it profit a man if he gain the whole world?" Why would he talk about gaining the whole world? Because if he's really the Christ, and if Peter's view of Christ is right, Peter thinks he's going to gain the whole world. He's going to be rich and powerful and one of the most important people on the face of the earth because he's right there with the Messiah. And Jesus says, well, what happens if you do that? Imagine you gain the whole world, but you lose your own soul. For whoever is ashamed, or what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his life or his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. So remember, the Son of Man, he just said in verse 31, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected. He says the Son of Man is going to come again in glory, though. And so your politic is about being in a right relationship with the Son of Man, and not about gaining the whole world, not about saving your life, not about having, man's interests, but God's interests. And so that is one of the first teaching points that Peter and Jesus get into. If you look at chapter 9 and verse 31, this is the second time that Jesus begins to fill his disciples in on what's about to happen. And it says, he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. And then verse 32 says, but they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. So again, it's kind of hard for the disciples to get along. They now think he's the Christ, but they don't have a clue what he's talking about when he talks about dying. In fact, if you look at chapter 9, after the transfiguration, Jesus tells Peter, James, and John, don't tell anyone what you see until after the Son of Man rises from the dead. And it says they seized upon that statement, discussing with one another what rising from the dead meant. Why don't they understand what rising from the dead means? Well, because they don't think he's going to be killed. They think he's going to kill the enemies. They think he's going to establish the kingdom in a physical, militaristic way. And so they don't understand what he's talking about with resurrection. Like, are you talking about the end of time or what? And right here, when he says that he's going to be killed and rise again, it says they didn't even understand and they were afraid to ask. But do you know what they do start talking about? They start talking about, all right, but when this kingdom does come, which of us is going to be the greatest in it? Which of us is going to be at the right hand of power? Which of us is going to have the most prominent seat at the table? And so, verse 33, they enter a house, and Jesus asks them, what were you talking about on the way? Verse 34 says, but they kept silent, for on the way they were discussing with one another, which of them was the greatest. That's not really how the conversation should be going at this point. That's the type of conversation that you have if you don't understand kingdom right, if you don't get your politics right. Which of us is the most important? Which of one of us can be given the most prominent seat? And so Jesus then calls a child, and he says, if anyone wants to be first, he will be last of all and servant of all. And taking a child, he set him before them, and taking him in his arms, he said, whoever receives one child like this in my name receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me. So Jesus wants them to understand that humility and service and even being last is what success looks like in his kingdom. It's very different than the kingdoms of this world. If you look at chapter 10, this is the third time that Jesus will fill his disciples in. And this time they're actually heading towards Jerusalem. They are like traveling to Jerusalem for the crucifixion. And he's going to fill them in one last time. So verse 32 says, and they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed him were fearful. Have you noticed how many times we've seen they are fearful, or they're afraid, or they're terrified? They're walking behind and they're fearful, and then he takes the 12 aside and he begins to explain. Verse 33, very clearly he says, behold, we are going to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, spit on him, scourge him, kill him, and 3 days later he will rise. And you know how they respond? They say virtually nothing about that. It's James and John, and they respond by saying, verse 35, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. Okay, and what do you ask of me? Jesus says in verse 36, what do you want me to do? In verse 37, they said, grant that we may sit one at your right and one at your left in your glory. Okay, so they're thinking thrones and power and kingdom in Jerusalem again. They're getting to Jerusalem. That's where it's all going to go down. So grant that when you do overthrow the Romans, that we could be at the right and at the left. And Jesus says in verse 38, you do not know what you are asking. They really don't. Who is at the right and the left of Jesus when he enters his glory? Criminals who were being crucified. They don't really want what they're asking. But then he says, are you able to drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And they're like, yeah, absolutely, we are able. And then Jesus says, well, you will eventually. But as for who will sit at my right and my left, that's not for me right now. But then the other 10, after hearing this conversation, they get really mad at James and John. Verse 41, hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. Why? Because they're trying to weasel their way into the best seats. Again, no one's understanding what Jesus is actually talking about here. And so they start getting mad because they think like they're trying to make a political alliance with Jesus to get a head seat at the table and leave the other 10 out. And so Jesus, finally, he calls them all to himself, verse 42, and he says, you know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles, they lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it's not to be this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great, which they all want to do, they were just talking about which of us is the greatest, which of us will have the greatest seat, which of us is going to be the best. He says, they're like Jesus told Peter, you're setting your mind on man's interests and not God's. He says, whoever wishes to be greatest among you shall be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first shall be slave of all. And then he says in verse 45, for the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. Even the ruler that you're following, he didn't come to be served by other people or to have people fawn at his greatness, but to serve. And to serve in the most dramatic way possible, to give his life a ransom for many. So Jesus says this, and then they continue their journey to Jerusalem, and they go through Jericho. And remember how this started with that first blind man who we healed in stages? He could see, just like the disciples, they saw now that he was the Christ, but they clearly weren't getting what that means. They didn't understand the sacrifice that the Christ was going to make, the death of the Christ, the resurrection of the Christ. All of that is lost on them. They're not seeing it clearly. But now they bring another blind man to Jesus. His name is Bartimaeus. And Jesus heals him not in stages, but as he's entering Jerusalem for the crucifixion, he gives him sight immediately. And the man gets up to follow. I think the idea here is the disciples were missing what Jesus was doing. But he's entering Jerusalem, and they're about to see it. The cross and the resurrection is where they begin to actually see what Jesus is all about. You can't understand the politics of Jesus, the kingdom of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus, without understanding that the greatest becomes last. The king is crucified. That should be our motivating, most powerful influence when it comes to what we think about when we think about politics, when we think about the kingdoms of this earth, when we think about the kingdom to which we've given our allegiance. It's not about my greatness. It's not about my wealth or my power or my prosperity or me always getting my way. It certainly isn't about exercising authority over other people or lording things over them. It's about being servant. It's about being last. It's not about saving my life. It's about giving my life. It's about carrying my cross and following after Jesus. We have a tendency to confuse politics with a me first attitude when even Jesus is trying to get us to change the way we think about power structures in this world, to change what we really think is the truest kingdom on this earth, more real than any other kingdom, and to change the way the nature of kingdom works. It's not always about getting power and authority for myself. It's about using myself to serve others. And we'll see how this is a difficult lesson for his disciples to get into, and how the cross is the most ultimate picture of what that is, which is why it's while on the cross, Jesus is wearing his crown with the plaque that says, the King of the Jews, with those on his right and on his left. That's all king imagery right there. But it's a different kind of king and a different kind of kingdom. It's a new kind of world and a different kind of politic. And we'll get into it more as the class continues.